Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack, and I am happy to be with you today. As a reminder, I have an upcoming online workshop, Breaking the Cycle of Relapse. I did end up needing to push the start date back a couple of weeks. So it is now going to start June 5th. It's an 8-week online workshop, like I said, starts at 6 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time and goes for an hour and a half, so till 7:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. You can register from wherever you are if that time zone works for you. If not, shoot me a message and let me know what time zone you prefer or that would work for you. And I'm happy to accommodate if I can. I'm also going to offer a free webinar to partners who have experienced betrayal trauma and partners who have struggled with sex addiction. If you feel like that will be helpful for you to learn and understand more about betrayal trauma, it'll be a 1-hour webinar that I will release the end of June. I'll let you know the date for that. So if you aren't subscribed to my podcast channel or to our business YouTube channel, Healing Paths Recovery, subscribe. Why are you subscribed? You will get notifications when that free webinar has been released. You'll get a notification for when that free webinar is available. And I will be offering more free webinars in addition to more online workshops. In addition to offering more online workshops. This past weekend, we wrapped up our 8-week online workshop, Healing Attachment Wounds, which was a lot of fun. It's a hard topic. It's a painful topic. There's going to be emotions for participants. But the great thing is we were working together as a group and being able to hear and understand each other's emotions and be able to validate what they were experiencing. So I'll be offering that online workshop again. So subscribe for dates of when content is available or when online workshops are going to be held, are going to be starting. Today, I wanted to start with a story. A couple weekends ago, I went to Phoenix for the ITAP Symposium. So ITAP is the organization. It stands for International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. They are the organization that oversees CSATs globally. We had some people internationally who would come to the symposium and presented or were participants. It was nice to have them share their thoughts and what they're seeing or working with in their part of the world. And then there's a lot of American CSATs that come to this conference. It's held in Phoenix, Arizona, which is the headquarters for ITAP. And usually I tell people that I am definitely an introvert. I can be very extroverted, I can be very social, and I enjoy it. But I refuel by time alone. So when I go to a symposium, there's a lot of socializing that I do. There's a lot of people that I have met along the way that are CSATs that I don't see very often in person and that I get a chance to catch up with and talk to, and people that they know that I get to meet. So it is a lot of socializing. And it's 3 days. So by the time I'm coming back home, I'm pretty exhausted. I gave Rachel a hard time for this because I've gone to symposium with Rachel for probably 6 or 8 years, something like that. And this time she was different than I have known her in the past to be. She was so chatty. And not that that's a bad thing. It was just, I hadn't seen her be that chatty before. On the way home, we're at the airport. Her and I had the same flight home. we're sitting in the Phoenix airport, waiting for our flight to board. It's late at night. We couldn't get a great flight time home. So our flight left at 8 p.m. We got in about 10:30. It's like an hour and 10-minute flight home, but Phoenix is an hour behind Utah. Well, during daylight savings time it is, because Arizona does not adjust times for daylight savings. So we're sitting at the airport. I'm done. I'm not a chatter at the airport. I usually keep to myself, and especially when I had been so social for 3 days. I'm sitting at the airport next to Rachel, and I have my headphones in. I think she had her earbuds, and I was playing a game on my iPad. And there was an adult man and a couple of, I think initially there were 4 teenage boys who came and sat down by us. And I saw them come sit down. I wasn't planning on talking to them. I was just doing my thing. And I only had one of my earbuds in. Often I'll do that so that I can hear if I need to hear them announce that our flight has been delayed or that they're getting ready to start boarding. So I just had one earbud in, and Rachel chats up. She starts this chat with the dad sitting across from us, this adult man. And she says, "Are you with a boys' baseball team?" And he said, "No, basketball." And I think she asked, "Oh, where are you coming from? Have you been here in Arizona?" And he said, "No, we were actually in Kansas playing a tournament and had a layover in Arizona, and we're headed back to Utah. That's where we're from." He was saying, "We're actually a high school boys basketball team. And in Kansas, we were playing a lot of comp basketball teams." And Rachel said, "Oh, how did you do?" And he said how they did. I don't recall what that was. I was not really engaging in the conversation. I thought it's just going to be brief. She's just chatting and then we'll finish. And so I hadn't stopped playing my game and I hadn't taken out my earbud. And she was asking him some questions. He was telling her how they did. They did okay, it sounded like. Rachel's continuing to talk. So I don't want to be rude. So I take out my earbud. I close my iPad. I'm not playing my game anymore. And he asks, "Where are you guys coming from?" And Rachel said, "Oh, we were here in Arizona for a work conference." And he said, "Oh, where was your work conference?" And Rachel said, "Here in Phoenix." And he was like, "Oh, where?" And I think he had looked at me at that point, and I said, "Oh, at the Hyatt Regency here in Phoenix." And so then he asked the question that they often do, "Oh, what do you do for work?" And Rachel said, "We're mental health therapists." And the conversation died down for a bit. I'm talking 3 or 4 minutes. I think he was talking to his sons or something. Rachel had asked where they were from, and he told us they were from Farmington, Utah. And I think Rachel asked, "Oh, so do they go to Farmington High School?" And he said, "Yeah." And that's when I noticed the school mascot on their t-shirt that the boys were wearing. And I said, "Oh, my nephew goes to Farmington High." And he said, "What's your nephew's name?" And I told him, and he said to some of the boys, I'm assuming one of them was his son. So he said to the boys, "Hey, do you guys know Carson Groves?" And one of the boys said, "Oh, yeah, Riffwood." And he looked at me, and another boy also commented, "Oh, right, Riffwood." And the dad looked at me and said, "Is that his last name?" And I said, "Oh, no, he's in a band. And the name of the band is Riffwood." And so he looks at the boys and he says, "Are they any good?" And the boys were like, "Yeah." And one of them started singing one of their songs, which doesn't do justice when you have guitar and drums and all of the stuff. And so the boy next to him, which I'm assuming is his son, we never found that out. The boy next to him pulled it up on his phone and was playing the song that the one boy started singing. And the dad is looking at the kid's phone and said, "Oh, which one's her nephew?" And he said, "Oh, he's here in the black shirt." And he's listening to it. And he was like, "Yeah, that's great." And I said, "Yeah, they recently signed with a record label." And one of the boys said, "Aren't they going on tour this summer or something?" And I said, "Yeah, they are. They're doing a tour this summer." And he asked me, "How old are they?" And I said, "Well, they're 16. I think one of them will be 16 at the end of the summer. I think they are sophomores at the high school." And they started playing during COVID. They had time on their hands, and my brother-in-law's musical and my sister's musical, they had finished their basement just before COVID, and they had put in a music room. My brother-in-law used to play drums in a band in high school. And so they put this music room in, and during COVID, they're home from school, they're bored, and Carson asked his dad, "Can you teach me how to play guitar?" And so my brother-in-law taught him how to play guitar. And then some of the friends were coming over, the other two members of the band. Well, they used to have four, but now there's three of them. And one of them asked also to learn to play the guitar. One wanted to learn to play the drums. And this is COVID, it shut down. So he's teaching them. When things started to open back up in 2021, my brother-in-law was like, "You probably should sign up for lessons. I'm probably at a point where I've taught you what I can, but if you really want to continue with this, you should sign up for lessons." So they did. And by the end of 2021, they were playing in my sister and brother-in-law's backyard, doing concerts. They have a pretty big backyard. They would play concerts, they would advertise it. They were also 11 years old in 2020, which was kind of amazing. And they've just grown. And I want to say it was just last school year when they were in ninth grade, they were able to enter the Utah PTA Battle of the Bands. And they were not in high school, they were in junior high. But I think one of the teachers or something helped them enter Battle of the Bands. And they won. They were first place, which was awesome. And they started getting more gigs. They were invited to play as part of winning Battle of the Bands. They were invited to play at the state fair. They were gifted some time in the studio to record. They've recorded their first album and are dropping their second album soon. And I think it was last October, I was at work and my sister texted me and said, "Hey, one of their TikToks of this new song that Carson wrote is going viral." And I went over to TikTok and I saw this little blurb of a new song that they were going to release that my nephew had written, and they were in their backyard. It's not a long video, it's maybe a minute or so, but it was going viral. At that point, had a couple million views. And so that weekend, my sister was telling me they spent the weekend having record labels reach out, music attorneys reach out, agents reach out. It was a whole thing. And one of the music agents had said, "Take your time making decisions." I think they first got an attorney in place and then eventually signed with a co-manager of the band. And then they signed with a record label just a few weeks ago. That's exciting. That's been going on. I don't know if I've mentioned that before on the podcast. So if you want to head over and check them out, they're on most of the music platforms, Spotify, iTunes. Their band is Riff, Riffwood, Riffwood, 2 words. And you'll find them. They write their music. They write the lyrics. They write the different parts for the guitar and drums, and kind of amazing to see the talent that these boys have. So we were talking about this. I mentioned this to the dad, not all of that information, but I mentioned that to the dad. And then the conversation died down a little bit, and we were quiet for, I don't know, 5 minutes maybe. I think I had put my earbud back in. I had opened back up my iPad, and the dad looked over at Rachel and I said, "So do you guys have a specialty as mental health therapists?" And Rachel says, "Yeah, Jackie, why don't you tell him what our specialty is?" So I take my earbud out, I put it away, and I said, "Well, we specialize in sexual health, infidelity, sexual trauma, pornography addiction, and sex addiction." And he was like, "Oh, wow, that's kind of a conversation killer." And I responded and said, "Yeah, that's typically what my husband says when people ask me what I do for work." And then the conversation stopped. At this point, or some point hereafter, Rachel went to the restroom, and I'm sitting there with my earbud in on my iPad, and the dad leans over and he's like, "Okay, so I do have some questions." And I was like, "Shoot, go for it." And so he was asking, "So this conference that you were at, was this all therapists who work in these areas?" And I said, "Yeah." And he's like, is it a large group?" And I said, "I mean, it's international. I'm really bad at guessing numbers of people there. I would guess a little over 1,000 maybe." And he was like, "Wow, that's kind of amazing." And so I think Rachel was back by this point. And he is telling us that he has 4 sons, and that he was LDS, and that he was really concerned about raising his sons in today's digital world. And he asked us, "What do you think about Snapchat?" He said, "It is how teens communicate with each other now. They don't do phone calls. Teens haven't done phone calls for a long time." He said, "They don't even text. They just communicate through Snapchat. So it's not like I could not allow my kids to have Snapchat, because then they're not going to be able to communicate with other people." And he said, "Snapchat just gives me some fears as a parent, because the information disappears after a time period." He also mentioned that being LDS in his faith community, he had recognized there were a lot of messages, especially to the youth, about morality and about sex. And they're not the most positive, they're not the most informative for teens, and they are pretty shame-based. And he said he tries really hard. He had learned that it was important not to shame his boys when it comes to anything sexual, but that he was worried about Snapchat and the features. But he brought up that he was worried about Snapchat and how images and messages on that app disappear, and how risky that can be, or there can be secret conversations involved that as a parent he may not know about. Rachel and I agreed that it was really good that he was already on the right track by not wanting to shame them. And he said that he usually goes on a drive with his kids and listens to a particular talk that he plays for his sons while they're on this drive, and that he asks them if they have any questions, and just talks to them about this talk on pornography. He asked, at this conference, were you guys talking about Snapchat? And I said, we were talking about Snapchat probably pre-COVID, not necessarily now. And Rachel agreed and said, yeah, we're talking about other things that are coming, like AI. We were mentioning just how important it is to keep communication open, and that it's not a one-time conversation, which I'll talk about. He was expressing some fear, I would say, about raising kids, raising teens especially, in today's digital age. And I mentioned that my kids are all adults now. They're young adults in their 20s. And that one of the things that I had learned and think is important for parents to understand is that you need to start conversations early, that you can focus on values like respect and consent, rather than just laying down the law or trying to scare them so that they don't go to those places. We were also sharing how we have seen in our work how shame-based approaches can actually backfire, leading kids to end up hiding things and keeping secrets from their parents and start to feel internalized shame, which ultimately puts them at greater risk. He shared some conversations that he had had with his brother-in-laws about this, and was asking us about that. Rachel and I nodded like, yep, we've heard those things. We work with those clients. He was asking some good questions. And by this time, I think the rest of the team started coming over. We were getting ready to board. Rachel and I went over and got in line to board. We were flying Southwest, which I don't love, but their prices on flights to Arizona, you can't really beat them. And that was pretty much the end of our conversation. And once I got home and was reflecting on this, I thought I should probably do a podcast episode about this. I know I've done a short that I released. It was maybe a 10 to 12 minute piece about how to talk to your teens about pornography. But I don't know that I have done a podcast episode, and I thought I need to do a podcast episode about it because this conversation with James, that was his name, the dad, has stayed with me. It's been on my mind, and it drove home a few key points for me. Number one, I think parents, caregivers, and therapists are hungry for guidance on how to handle teen sexuality in a healthy way. Even a brief airport chat revealed how much fear and uncertainty is out there, and also how much hope and openness when people get past the initial discomfort. In this short conversation, we touched on a lot of crucial themes: shame and how it impacts kids, the need for safe and trusted adults who are willing to have these conversations in a teen's life, and early and ongoing conversations about sex. One that I would add that we didn't necessarily touch on was core values like respect, consent, and trust, and the challenges of technology and pornography in today's world. So by the time I woke up the next morning and started thinking about this, I knew that I wanted to unpack all of this plus more in a podcast episode. So that's exactly what I'm going to do in today's episode. I'll share some research, clinical insights, and practical tips on these topics. We'll talk about how shame affects adolescent sexual development and why having shame-free Ask Me Anything adults in a teen's life is so important. Why we need to start talking about healthy sexuality earlier than you might think, and how to actually talk with kids about sex in a way that promotes respect, consent, and trust. I'll also dive into navigating the digital landscape, everything from social media and Snapchat to online pornography, with an eye toward teaching digital responsibility, empathy, and boundaries. Throughout this episode, I'll also sprinkle in supporting research, statistics, and quotes by experts, as well as citing some studies. This is not going to be a dry academic lecture, though, because that's not the kind of conversation you can have with your kids or your teens. Whether you're a seasoned sex addiction or betrayal trauma therapist, or a parent, or both, or just someone interested in how we raise healthier kids, I hope you'll find value in this discussion today. Let's start by looking at the first big issue that James brought up at the airport: shame. and why avoiding shame in our conversations with teens is absolutely critical. When James, the guy at the airport, mentioned that he tries not to shame his boys, I'm sure growing up in the LDS culture, like I did, he felt a lot of shame-laden messages in his own youth. He wasn't growing up in today's digital society, but he was touching on something really important. Shame and sexuality have a long, tangled history, especially in cultures or families with strict moral or religious codes. It might seem like scaring or shaming kids about sex would keep them on the straight and narrow, but in reality, shame can seriously derail healthy development and even lead to the very behaviors that adults fear. So first, I want to start by clarifying some terms. When I'm talking about shame, shame is that deep sense of I am bad or I am unworthy of love because of who I am or what I've done. It's feeling fundamentally flawed. Guilt, on the other hand, is more like I did something wrong, or I acted against my values, or I made a mistake, and I feel bad about the action. Guilt can be healthy. That's often what motivates a person to make amends or to change their behavior. Shame, however, tends to be corrosive and isolating. As renowned shame researcher Brené Brown puts it, quote, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. And she continues, crucially, shame needs three things to grow exponentially in our lives: secrecy, silence, and judgment. Think about that. Secrecy, silence, and judgment. Those are exactly what often surround sexual topics with teens when shame is present. If a teen is feeling ashamed, they're more likely to go silent, keep secrets, and feel judged or prejudge themselves. What effect does all this have on a young person's sexual development? Research gives us some eye-opening answers. A long-term study followed a group of children from around 5th grade into young adulthood, looking at those who were prone to guilt versus those who were prone to shame. And the findings were striking. Kids who had a higher tendency toward guilt, feeling bad about bad actions, ended up engaging in healthier behaviors as young adults. While kids prone to shame, feeling like they were a bad person, were actually at higher risk for a host of problems. More specifically, the guilt-prone kids, once grown, had fewer sexual partners, used drugs less, and were less likely to get in trouble with the law. The shame-prone kids were more likely to have unprotected sex and to use illegal drugs in young adulthood. And these results held true even after accounting for other factors like their family socioeconomic status. And even the kids' aggression levels were differently rated by their teachers. In other words, shame in childhood or adolescence was a unique risk factor for later risky sexual behavior. Let that sink in. The very thing that many people try to use as a deterrent, which is shaming a kid to scare them off of sex or sin, make it more likely that the kid engages in risky sex, including unprotected intercourse later on. And why would that be? Well, shame tends to make a person feel worthless or like they've already failed. So they might think, what's the point in trying to be good? I'm already bad. And as I said, shame often leads to secret keeping and avoidance. A shamed teen isn't going to ask an adult a question about birth control or porn use. because they fear judgment or they think they'll be in trouble. Shame can also create a kind of rebellion or acting out once the internal pressure gets too high. There's a concept in psychology that what we resist persists. A parallel idea is that repressing natural sexual feelings too harshly can actually amplify them in unhealthy ways. In fact, even within religious communities, there's recognition of this. I will say here, this may not change how they message, but there can be statements that recognize this. An article on the official LDS Church website noted that an overly rigid, shame-based religious approach to teen sexuality can backfire. It described how some youth from rigid and legalistic religious backgrounds that wrap sexuality in shame and guilt try so hard to repress their natural sexual feelings that it actually strengthens the hold of those very feelings. When they eventually act on those repressed desires, often in secret, they are flooded with shame and self-loathing, which then perpetuates a destructive cycle. In other words, on the church website, they are acknowledging that shame breeds more of the behaviors that cause the shame, and round it goes. You would think with this acknowledgement on their website that the messaging may change, and maybe it is. I haven't paid attention to what the LDS Church is teaching or saying. What I do know, however, is that if from the top, how they are talking about sex is beginning to change, that takes a long time to get down to the average member sitting in the pew. We see this cycle often in our clinical practice. As a therapist specializing in sexual trauma and sexual addictions, many of my adult clients can trace their struggles back to shame in adolescence. For example, some sex addicts recall growing up in environments where any mention of sex was taboo, where they were taught that even having a sexual thought, or heaven forbid, masturbating, made them dirty or sinful. And what happens then if a 13-year-old believes they're bad for having normal sexual curiosities and urges? Well, they won't seek out healthy outlets or accurate information. Instead, they'll hide and indulge in secret without guidance, and often with great guilt and shame. This can lay the groundwork for compulsive behaviors. Similarly, we've worked with women who experienced betrayal trauma and who realized that both they and their husbands grew up with zero healthy conversations about sex. Instead, they only really talked about rules and shame. And the result was that neither of them developed a healthy, positive understanding of sexuality or boundaries. It's a tough realization, but it also leads to empowering them because it means breaking the shame cycle now. And this might lead to preventing the next generation from experiencing the same pain. I want to be clear, letting go of shame does not mean letting go of morals or values. We can guide and teach teens about sexual values, ethics, and safety without using shame as a weapon. And we know that doing so is far more effective. There's an important distinction here between guilt and shame. If a teen violates a family rule or their own values, maybe they lied or they engaged in some risky activity, expressing appropriate disapproval of the behavior is okay. But attacking the teen's character or making them feel inherently dirty or evil is never constructive. Brené Brown has a great line on this. She says, quote, "Shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change," end quote. In contrast, acknowledging a mistake with guilt, but still feeling fundamentally loved and capable, that mindset helps a young person say, I can do better next time. It frames it as though they are learning through life experience to have wisdom. Let me underscore one more reason shame is so damaging for adolescents. It silences them. A teenager who feels ashamed because of something that happened to them or something they did, or even their own feelings, is a teenager who is very unlikely to reach out for help. This has serious implications. For instance, studies on child and teen sexual abuse have found that feelings of shame are a major barrier to victims disclosing the abuse or seeking help. And abusers often rely on this. They might instill shame in the victim, making them feel somehow complicit in their own abuse. So the victim feels too embarrassed or guilty or ashamed to tell anyone. In less extreme cases, a teen who got carried away with a boyfriend or girlfriend and now feels bad or ashamed will likely hide that and deal with the consequences alone. Shame, we know that shame equals secrecy. And when sexual matters are kept secret in the teen years, usually that spells trouble. However, if we remove shame from the equation, we create space for openness and intervention. I often tell parents, you actually want to know if your kids slip up or are struggling. You want them to come to you. That's 100 times better than them thinking, mom or dad would be so mad at me or they would hate me, I can't tell them. So to wrap up this section, shame is not a healthy teacher or motivator for teens, or really even adults when it comes to sexuality. The research is clear that it correlates with worse outcomes, including more risky sex and other problem behaviors later on. And clinically, we know it drives problems into the shadows where they can fester. Reducing shame doesn't mean we suddenly encourage kids to behave recklessly. It means we encourage them to talk, to ask, and to learn without fear of humiliation or condemnation. For this dad who we met at the airport, his instinct not to shame his sons is absolutely right, and to initiate conversations with his sons about porn and about sex. It's one of the best things he can do for, or any parent can do, for teens' healthy development. So if shame is what not to do, what's the flip side? The flip side is creating safety and trust, being the kind of adult a teen can turn to. And I want to explore that next. So let's put ourselves back into this place of being a teenager. Imagine you're a teenager facing the confusing, hormone-fueled wilderness of your adolescence. Your body is changing, your emotions are riding a roller coaster, peers are talking about crushes or sex or porn they saw, and the internet offers a million answers. Again, that's not the childhood I had. I came across pornographic magazines out in the field behind my house, and I saw neighbor boys looking at them. But this wasn't on the internet. And I grew up with questions that I really didn't find answers to until much later. However, now the internet offers a million answers, many of which are misleading or even scary about sex. So if you, as a teen, like me, didn't really have an adult that you trusted to talk about any of it, you're on your own. And if you mess up, you certainly won't tell the adults in your life because you expect anger or disappointment or punishment. Unfortunately, that's the reality for a lot of teens today. Many teens do not have an open channel with their parents or any other safe adult when it comes to sexuality. And that is exactly what we need to change. I know for my kids, when they were growing up, we had conversations about sex from the time they were young. And I'll talk about what that can look like, how at different ages, it's appropriate to talk about different things. But at some point, you have to tie it all together and connect the dots for your kids. I also experienced with my kids that often their friends would come over and they might say, "Hey, mom, my friends have questions about sex and they want to ask you." And I would say, "Okay, what questions do you have?" And I would talk to them about sexuality, and particularly healthy sexuality that had values behind what I was talking about, as well as statistics and knowledge and understanding. One of my kids, when she was living away at college, she was an hour and a half away from us. And she had texted me when she was going to come home on a Sunday, and she had texted me and said, "Hey, can I bring these two boys that she knew at college?" She said, "Can I bring them home for dinner today? And they also have questions for you about sexuality." And I was like, "Sure, bring them home. Happy to answer any questions they have." Which really I was. I was actually impressed that they were willing to ask questions of this adult that they barely met. Going back to this dad at the airport, James clearly was trying to be that safe, non-judgmental presence for his boys. When he said, "I try not to shame them," and he sought advice on how to handle things constructively, that right there is gold. Being a safe adult doesn't mean you remove all rules or that you never feel discomfort. It means the young person knows that you're going to listen, you will love them no matter what, and you will guide them without making them feel uncomfortable or you freaking out. I did mention to him, because he was saying how frightening it is to raise kids in this digital world. I said, when I became a CSAT, I think my oldest was in the 7th or 8th grade. And what I was learning scared me about raising kids, even in that world, and which has continued to evolve from then to where we are now in 2025. And I said, I had asked one of the experts in this field, especially on sex and technology. I had asked him once at dinner, how do parents process all of this? And what is the best way to address this with kids? And he said, well, the reality is every generation has had kids who fall through the cracks. And every generation has also had things that they were concerned about their kids being exposed to. He did acknowledge that's different than what we're seeing today with technology. But he said, if you're only focused on things that you're trying to prevent your kids from seeking out, it's not going to work. They will always find a way to find that. He said, what you want instead is for them to come to you when they see something and to ask you questions instead of taking those questions to Google. And I remember when he told me that, thinking, I think that's really good advice. Like I said, my oldest was in like 7th or 8th grade by that point. But I had, from the time they were young, started talking to them about their bodies and about sexual things age appropriately, that allowed me to start integrating this information into some of those conversations. I also felt like, and I told my friends at this time, I was over at her house and 2 of our kids were the same age. I think they were in the 3rd grade, and her daughter had come home from school and was talking nonstop about the day. And after her daughter left and went downstairs, she said to me, how do you handle pretending to be interested in what the 3rd grader is telling you about their day? I said, well, if you're not interested in what your 3rd grader is coming and telling you, when you do want to know what they're experiencing throughout their day in the later teen years, they're not going to come to you then. I think those conversations and interest have to start at very young ages. I'll talk about this further in this episode. But I want to talk about why having your kids come to you and talk to you is so important. There is a wealth of research showing that parent-child communication and connection is a protective factor for all kinds of teen outcomes, sexual health included. For example, studies have found that good parent-child communication about sexuality is linked to teens being more likely to use contraception and practice safe sex, and less likely to engage in high-risk sexual behaviors. I found that teens themselves often say they want guidance from an adult. I think for many teens, they want that adult to be their parents. In one survey, a majority of teens reported that they'd prefer to get information about birth control from their parents rather than from friends or media or even health classes. So again, think about that. Despite how it might seem, because I've had parents talk to me about how their kids, when they try to bring up these conversations, are sullen, they're silent, or they have eye rolls or sighs. I tell them, regardless, deep down, most kids want reliable information and values from mom or dad. They don't want lectures. They don't want judgmental scolding. And they don't want you to be so uncomfortable that it distresses them. They want a dialogue and trust. When one of my kids was in high school, she had started dating a boy. She had gone on dates with boys or gone to dances with boys, but she wasn't interested much past the second day. And I did ask her, how come you go out with these boys once or twice and then you don't go out with them anymore? And her answer, she said, well, I think they want different things from me than I want. And I asked her what she meant by that. Oh, what do they want that you don't want? And she said this time she was very focused on soccer and she wanted to play college soccer. And she said, well, right now, soccer is my biggest priority, but I think they just want to spend all this time together and make out. And that's not my biggest priority. Again, super glad she was telling me that. Super glad I asked follow-up questions. We had a soccer game and it was probably at least an hour. I want to say it was an hour and a half drive for us each way. So I had some time with her. It was just her and I going to the soccer game. I had some time with her in the car. And at this time she had started dating a guy and they'd been dating 6 months, I want to say. And she was in high school and we were in the car and I brought it up. Often if we were driving in the car to a soccer game, she needed to focus. She had a playlist that I had to listen to. She really didn't want me talking to her because she was trying to get in her zone to play the game, drive. And so on the drive down, I let her get into her frame of mind. I let her get into her zone. We played the playlist. If the playlist wasn't long enough for the drive, we'd let it restart. I kept to myself and didn't really talk to her because she was getting in the zone to play and she didn't want any distractions. So I would respect the boundary that she set, but on the way home, we could have conversations. And so on the way home, I brought up that it seemed like this relationship had so far been longer than other relationships. I acknowledged that she had told me she didn't really want to date other boys longer than 2 dates because of the mismatch in what they wanted versus what she wanted. And she was telling me about this relationship and what was different about him and that he lets her be herself and that he understands that soccer is really important to her. And he was playing hockey. And she did say his passion for hockey isn't the same. I think I have more passion for soccer, but he understands it. He gets it. And she said he wants to spend time together and I'm okay with that. And so that's why she was willing to have it turn into a long-term relationship. And it was a long-term relationship. That relationship lasted 8 years. And they just recently broke up last year. I brought up, and I fully expected her to say, Mom, I'm not talking about that. And for her to just dismiss me. But she didn't. So I said, at your age, when you get into long-term relationships, he may, or both of you may want to be sexual. And I said, I think it's important that we talk about birth control because that's the most effective thing for preventing teen pregnancy. And she responded and was like, I do not have time to get pregnant as a teenager. And I was like, exactly. You have other priorities. You have things that you're interested in. And I said, we need to have conversations about birth control. And I said, most forms of birth control for females require a prescription. I said, so it's not like you can go to the store like you can buy condoms at the store for you to be safe. And we talked about why condoms aren't necessarily enough and how it may or may not protect her from STIs. And so we talked about, we're going to need some advance notice to get you into a doctor and to get you the prescription for birth control. And I was surprised that she didn't shut me down and didn't dismiss me or tell me that she already knew. And instead she said, I guess I didn't know there's different types of birth control. What are the different types? And so we had a conversation about the different types and the pros and the cons and why it was as important for him to protect himself as it was for her to protect herself. And she acknowledged if I was open to having sex, he would be okay with that. But it just seems too complicated to bring into my life at this point. And I validated, yeah, having a sexual relationship brings certain complications, especially at your age. And I asked her why that wasn't something she was interested in. We talked the whole hour and a half home. It was a really good conversation. I was also aware that building that type of trust starts with how we handle small stuff. If a 10-year-old comes to a parent and asks, what's a virgin? They hear this language. Or maybe a 13-year-old sheepishly admits, I looked up something online and I saw people doing stuff. Those are some pivotal opportunities. How we respond in those moments teaches our kids whether or not we are a safe resource. We can tell them that we are, but in those moments, if we are not, they won't believe what we say. If we respond with anger or fear or a punishment, we send the message that their question made us upset, that they did something wrong, and that we don't want them to do it again, and we're really not open for a conversation about it. That makes that kid very unlikely to ever bring you a sensitive problem again. Essentially, the door closes for these conversations. On the other hand, if we respond with composure and some compassion and curiosity, saying something like, oh, how did you hear that term? Getting some context for where this question is coming from. And then saying, well, I'm so glad you came and asked me. Let's talk about this, or let's talk about what you saw, or this is a really good question. I'm impressed that you're coming to me and asking, and you're curious about learning about this. Then we are sending the message that we can handle their questions, that we're here for them, that we can figure it out. And the door starts to swing wide open for future communication. One of the questions that came up once with one of my kids, we had a dog. He's still going. He's 17 and a half years old. A couple of weeks ago, my husband texted me. He works from home and he said, hey, I think we might be near the end. He's sleeping a lot. He doesn't seem very active like his usual self. But the next week, he was fine. He wasn't sleeping all the time. He's up, he's walking around. He has anxiety and he's completely deaf. He has been for like 3 years. But he doesn't have a poor quality of life. This past Sunday, we took him on a walk with our other dogs, and we did notice okay, he is slowing down. We've noticed for a while his back leg muscles are getting weaker and they're not as strong as they used to be. But again, he is 17 and a half years old. So we have this male dog. And I hadn't really thought about the fact that when I'm changing one of our new babies, what they're seeing is the same body parts that they had. They had no questions. So my daughter, she was probably 6 or 7 at the time. And we're in a family setting. And she said, this particular dog, his name is Zeke. And she said, I know what Zeke's penis is, but what's the gobbler thing hanging down? At first, I wasn't sure what she was asking because I'm thinking of a gobbler on a turkey that's on their neck. Pretty quickly, it dawned on me. And I said, oh, I pointed them out, these things. And she said, yeah. And I said, well, those are called testicles. And males have them along with their penis. They have testicles. And she was curious. What do testicles do? And so I explained the purpose and the function of testicles and how, we had him neutered. That process erupted him being able to create offspring. There's so many natural questions that just come up for kids that are tangentially sexually related. And then there's other questions that they have that aren't necessarily about sex, but it matters how you respond to them in those moments. One powerful way to be a safe adult is to normalize conversations about sexuality and bodies. If the only time these topics come up is when there's trouble or when you're delivering a grave warning, of course the kid will associate talking about sex with negativity. Instead, try to weave in casual, age-appropriate talks now and then. It might be a comment on a storyline in the TV show. You might, after the TV show's over, or at dinner, we had a lot of dinner discussions saying, in this show today that you guys were watching, the couple on the show didn't talk about consent. What did you think of that? My 2 oldest were young adult readers when the Twilight series came out, and I knew that they had read the first book. And for me, if my kids were going to read a book, I read books. I've read a lot of young adult books, and there's a lot of great ones. I didn't particularly love the Twilight series, but if my kids were reading it, I was reading it. And so in the first book, when Edward is in Bella's bedroom watching her sleep, to me as a parent, I'm like, that's weird. And so I would talk to my kids about the book. I was reading it at the same time that they were. You did not lecture them about what I was reading in the book. Instead, I asked questions. And I asked a question like, what do you think about Edward being in Bella's bedroom and watching her sleep while she's sleeping? And my oldest was like, I think that's weird. And my second daughter said, I don't think I could sleep if somebody was sitting there watching me. And I was like, yeah, it is kind of weird, huh? That would be hard to sleep when somebody is staring at you. Again, these conversations, gauging, how are they feeling about what they're reading, about what they're watching on TV. Parents can make it routine to talk about what kids are reading, what kids are watching, and weave in conversations about relationships, about boundaries, about body changes. You send the message that nothing is taboo to discuss, and it's an open conversation. Sometimes as therapists, I've used the term an askable adult. Be the askable adult in your kid's life. The one they know they can ask any awkward question, even if you don't have the right answer, or you don't have the right answer right away. Let them know you'll get it for them. Even if it makes you internally freak out a little bit, or it makes you blush, know that you're not going to shame them for asking. An askable adult in a teen's life is gold. I have had many clients tell me, I wish I had had just one adult I could have asked all the weird questions when I was a teen. I had nobody, and I made a lot of mistakes because of that. I think it's also important to acknowledge that not every teen will talk to their parent. Some just won't, especially if the relationship has been strained. That's why it can be great for parents to help connect their teens to other safe adults, or to talk with other adults about talking with their teens. This might be an aunt or an older cousin or a family friend or a coach or a therapist. Somebody who the family or the parents know will respect their values and communicate helpfully. It's not an insult if your teen finds it easier to open up to their Aunt Jane about their crush than to you. The important thing is that they have someone trustworthy to talk to, rather than only peers or the internet. Of course, as a parent, you still stay involved and aware. It is a team effort. You can't just offload the responsibility to somebody else. And this may mean that Aunt Jane has to have a conversation with the teen saying, hey, is it okay if I talk to your parents and let them know what I've shared with you or talked with you about? So that the teen is giving consent to looping in their parents. Dr. Elizabeth Weinstein, a Harvard researcher who studies teens' digital behaviors, said something in an interview that really struck me. She said, if we do not show up for these conversations with teens, we are not equipping them to navigate those situations and the pressures they're facing. This was in a Washington Post article. So in context of the article, she was talking about conversations on tough topics like sexting, but it also applies broadly. Showing up for these conversations means being present, listening, guiding, even when it's awkward or tough. Another angle to consider, being a safe, shame-free adult doesn't mean no boundaries or accountability. Often parents worry, if I'm too understanding, am I just giving them permission to do whatever they want? Not at all. You can still have rules. The difference is in the delivery and the rationale. You can't just give them a rule or a rationale for why you're doing something, for why you're making a rule that says, because we said so. A shame-based rule might sound like, if you ever have sex before marriage, you'll disgrace this family. Or don't you dare be that stupid. A shame-free, but also values-based message, on the other hand, might sound like, in our family, we believe that sex is something meaningful. We also believe that it helps to wait until you're older and in a committed relationship, because we think that's how you will be safest, both emotionally and physically. And they know what that means because you've had those conversations already. One of these approaches slams the door on conversations, essentially saying, don't do that or you're bad. The other one invites conversations while still conveying a value or a belief. The second one leaves room for the reality that the teen might act outside of your ideal. And if they do, they can still come to you for help without fearing that you'll consider them disgraced. Let me tie this back to the earlier topic of shame with a quote from Brené Brown again. She says, nothing silences us more effectively than shame. Our goal needs to be the opposite, to invite voice, not silence from our kids. By being safe and supportive, we create an environment where they are much less likely to be silenced. And if they're not silenced, that means they're talking to people. And hopefully that means they're talking to you, which means you can guide, influence, teach, and help them. I've established why shame is harmful and why a trusted, open relationship between adults and teens is protective. When should these conversations start? Many people assume that you wait until the kid starts puberty or starts acting interested. However, by then you've missed years of opportunity. So I want to talk about the timing and why healthy sexuality conversations have to begin before adolescence, as well as how to go about it. There's this popular idea of the talk, as in a big one-time conversation about the birds and the bees. often when a kid hits puberty. I know for me, when I was younger, it was kind of awkward. My mom came in, and I think she was concerned about my best friend's older brother. Not that he was doing anything, but just that he might openly talk about sexual things when I was at their house. And she wasn't necessarily wrong, but I also did not understand what he meant when he said things. I think I was about 8, maybe 7, and I was in the bathtub, taking a bath for the night before getting ready for bed. And I don't know why my mom decided that was the time to come in and sit on the toilet lid and talk to me, but she did. I remember the bath water getting cold, but she wasn't done talking. And that's how I had the big talk. She was having a conversation with me when I was younger than puberty, but a lot of it went over my head. And also, I felt very vulnerable being naked in a bathtub. Increasingly, experts and educators are telling us that this model of the big talk is outdated. And honestly, I don't think it was ever effective to begin with. Instead of a single talk, we need an ongoing series of age-appropriate talks that start early and continue throughout the teen years. Ideally, we're having conversations about bodies and boundaries, consent, and sex, and conversations about sex that begin well before adolescence in small, natural ways, so that by the time puberty arrives, it's already a comfortable topic in the household. So how early is before adolescence? I would say, honestly, from toddlerhood onward, you're laying the groundwork. Now, that might sound surprising, but early conversations are obviously very different from teen conversations. For a 2 or 3-year-old, when we're talking about consent, we're watching this toddler go and take this toy from another kid who's playing with it. And we say, hey, you didn't ask. This other kid was playing with it. He's not done. You need to go give the toy back. They're not going to like that at 2 or 3. And we might need to distract them with another cool, exciting toy that they can play with. Or sometimes that kid would come over and say, here, your turn. Do you want it? We're trying to teach them consent long before we're talking about sexual consent. We're talking about bodies. They're learning the names of different parts of their body, their eyes, their nose, their ears, their mouth, their hair, their hands, all of those things they're learning. It seems fairly natural to start also teaching them the proper names for their genital part. And we're talking with kids about boundaries. Again, in age-appropriate ways that they can understand. I do think it's important to teach kids the proper names for body parts instead of silly nicknames, as well as introducing the concept of bodily autonomy. When one of my kids was young, we had lived with my mom. We were building a house. We knew when it was supposed to be done, which it's never on time. It's never when they project that it's going to be. But we had sold our house and we had a close date and we had to move out. Our builder had told us that it was going to be a month. So we had this month between selling our house and having to move out before we could move into the new house. And I think 1 month actually in reality was 4 months. But at the time we thought it was 1 month. My husband had said, it just makes sense to move in with your mom. My mom was an empty nester. It didn't make sense to me. And I did tell him, I don't know if that's a great idea. And he was saying, it's only going to be a month. The places that would rent to us with a family of 4 kids for 1 month, they're not going to be great areas of town that will rent for 1 month. So we moved in with my mom and with one of my kids, who people often say she is a lot like me. My mom and her got into frequent arguments and conflicts. She was in kindergarten. They would argue over what chair she had to sit at the dinner table. Things like that that just don't matter. I don't think growing up we had certain chairs at the dinner table. I did not understand why my mom was so hung up on you have to sit on this chair, not this chair. And of course, she preferred the chair that she wanted to pick, not the one my mom told her she had to sit in. So there was a lot of conflict over that 4 months living with my mom. It brought up a lot of childhood stuff for me as well, watching this and trying to reason with my mom, but also feeling protective of this daughter. I think we moved out in October, and now it's Christmas. And this daughter particularly, she hadn't worked through the conflict with grandma. She didn't really like grandma. Eventually she did, but it makes sense that having so much conflict with her grandma when we were living with grandma ended up causing damage to the relationship. So it's Christmas Eve. We were at my mom's house and we're getting ready to leave. And, you know, my mom is saying, come give me a hug and a kiss before you leave. And my 3 other kids ran and gave grandma a hug and a kiss. And this one wouldn't. And she just stood next to me. And my mom said, come give me a hug and a kiss. And she said, I don't want to. And my mom starts pretending that she's sad and she gets pouty lips and sadness, like, grandma feels bad. Grandma wants a hug and a kiss. And so I just said, Mom, eventually these kids are going to get older. They're going to be dating. Right now, you have the opportunity to help teach them that they don't have to hug and kiss anybody that they don't want to, or that they do have to kiss and hug people that they don't want to. And I said it in a way that wasn't rude about what was happening or why she might not want to hug and kiss grandma goodbye. My mom, she was a smart woman, and she said, oh, right, okay. And she said, all right, well, have a good Christmas morning. I love you, and didn't make her come give her a hug and a kiss before we left. I think that's important to teach small kids. And if you have an adult like my mom who didn't understand that and was trying to force the issue, to have a conversation about what you're trying to teach the child, why it's important, and rally them to be part of the team reinforcing that. You can say to your child, if you don't want to give grandma a hug and a kiss, that's okay. Maybe you can just wave goodbye. Now, these are small things, but they are young kids, and they send a big message that your body is your own, and talking about it isn't shameful or forbidden, and you don't get in trouble for saying what you want or don't want. Peggy Orenstein, who's a journalist and extensively interviewed young people for her books, Girls and Sex and Boys and Sex, advises parents to start at birth with building a healthy foundation. This means using correct terms, a matter-of-fact tone about bodies from the get-go. It sets the stage that this is just another part of life that we discuss. By early elementary age, conversations often expand to things like where babies come from. And you can explain this in a simple, truthful way that's appropriate for a 5 or 6-year-old. Talking about private parts being private, talking about good touch and bad touch, and talking about safety from sexual abuse without making them afraid of the world and the people in their life. As a parent, that's your job to keep the dangerous people out and the good people in. It's your job to protect your child, not theirs. But we do talk about these things. I know at young ages, I had conversations with my kids about secrets. I would say, we don't keep secrets. We talked about surprises, that sometimes, they might know a surprise for one of their sister's birthdays and they didn't go tell them because it's a surprise. And we wait until their birthday and they open the gift or whatever. We talked about confidentiality. And my kids, when they were young, I remember one of my neighbors saying, yeah, your daughter mentioned confidentiality the other day. And it was a big word for her. And she said, I asked her, do you know what that means? And she repeated her definition of what that meant and was right. I explained to my neighbor, oh yeah, we have these conversations. And in addition to talking about secrets, I would say, Secrets hurt feelings or they hurt people. So we don't keep secrets. Some of this, I had 4 girls. I didn't want them causing a lot of drama. I remembered friends who would tell one person a secret and 3 other girls are standing there and they don't get told the secret. And it hurts your feelings. And if I was the kid that got told a secret, I always felt weird. Like now I have to not tell these other 3 friends. I was also aware that often if kids are sexually abused, they are told to keep a secret. And so that was just one of the ways we talked to our kids about secrets. Secrets can hurt feelings and they can hurt people, and we don't have secrets. We can have surprises. We can have confidentiality. I feel like there was one more that we carved out, other ways that secrets would be talked about. And often we checked in with our kids. Every couple of months, we would say, hey, has anybody told you a secret or told you about keeping something secret that you haven't told mom and dad yet? Often it was my mom. It was grandma. And if she was babysitting, she would say, don't tell your mom I let you eat on the carpet, or don't tell your mom. It usually harmless, but also, mom, why were you doing that? They would tell us, here's what the secrets are. Or somebody told us to keep the secret, and now we tell you because we don't keep secrets. Again, these are not one-time lectures. They're gentle, recurring themes. I remember one of the times my brother was in town. He was in law school at Columbia, and he was in town, and he came over for one of our dinners. He was married, but he didn't have kids at that time. And so he was over. And again, our dinner conversations were often a place that we talked about things, and our kids would ask questions. And one of them had asked a question. I want to say it was the time when the sexual abuse case was going on with Michael Jackson, and they had overheard something on TV. And so we talked about it. And later, my brother said, your kids know what sex abuse is? And I said, yeah, they do. And he was like, why do they know that? And I said, well, we've told them what it is because as a therapist, I learned that often kids didn't tell parents because they didn't have the language to tell parents. And the language they tried to come up with, often their parents didn't understand what they were trying to say. So I wanted my kids to have the vocabulary. And he was like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then he said, do they know what sex is? And I said, well, not yet, they're too young. As a parent, I had read that if you haven't talked to your kids about sex by the 4th grade, which is when they're 9 or 10, they will hear about it first from somebody else. I didn't want that to happen as a parent. Again, we had talked to our kids in different ways about sex. They had a lot of sexual knowledge, but they weren't exactly sure what the big picture was with all of this sexual knowledge. And usually the summer before they started 4th grade, them and I would go out to lunch and we would have the conversation. And I would start, with all of the pieces of information that we had given them over time. And then I would connect the dots. And what I learned is there's no vague way of connecting the dots. You have to be explicit. You have to be, not overly graphic, but you have to be explicit about what you're connecting for them, because otherwise they don't know. They don't have that knowledge yet. One of my kids, when we were at lunch having this conversation, they knew that we were going to have an important conversation about their body. And she'd asked me, this is very much her personality, should I bring a notebook so I can take notes? And I said, if you want to bring a notebook, bring a notebook. And she had her notebook and she had it on the table, but she never actually opened it and was writing in it. And for getting near the end of our lunch and the end of our conversation, and she said, oh no, I forgot to take any notes. And I said, well, you can ask me. If you forget things or if you have questions about things I haven't talked about, you can still ask me. And she was like, oh, right. And I was like, yeah, we can continue having as many conversations as we need to about this. And then she said, when I'm a mom, will you come to these lunches when I talk to my kids so that I don't forget things to go over with my kids? And I said, well, I would be happy to come with you and your kids when you're having these conversations. But also, if you have kids, and she kind of like slaps her forehead, and she's like, oh my gosh, then I already know how this information works. And I'm like, right, you would already know how this information works, and you would probably know as much as I do. And she was like, oh, okay, I still might want you to come. And I said, I would be happy to come. It can be a lot for a kid that age. But when it's phrased calmly and in an educational way, if they're having curiosity, it satisfies that curiosity. And if not, it's giving them information that they're going to be needing or they're going to be exposed to soon in their life. I would also say to my kids, I usually gave some disclaimer about, things that some parents may not tell their kids for many more years. And if you start telling your friends about what we've talked about, it might make their parents upset or uncomfortable. I don't know how their parents would feel about that. So this is probably best something that we talk about at our house. And, they knew that their dad knew that this conversation was going on. He was just home with the other kids. Research supports the idea that starting the conversation early has a lot of benefits. One study analysis noted that effective parent-child communication models often showcase conversations that begin before adolescence, often prompted by a child's question and answered appropriately by a parent. This kind of back and forth over time is a lot better than just one-time big talk information dump. By engaging in many small conversations throughout childhood, children come to see their parents as a reliable source of sexual information. They learn that they can always come back with more questions, and they'll get incremental information as needed. In other words, the talk can't be a monologue. Instead, it's a dialogue that unfolds in different chapters as a child matures. As I said, often parents can fear that if they talk to their kids about sex or puberty or birth control too early, they will be encouraging their child to experiment or become sexual sooner. The good news here is there is a lot of research that has debunked this myth. Comprehensive sexuality education and open parent-child discussions do not cause children to start having sex earlier. In fact, it tends to delay sexual initiation and leads to healthier choices if and when teens do become sexually active. A review by UNESCO of 87 studies worldwide found that good sex education does not encourage earlier sexual activity. Instead, it often makes it more likely that teens will wait longer to have sex for the first time. And when these educated teens eventually have sex, even if this is in young adulthood, studies show that they have fewer partners and higher rates of condom use or other birth control methods, resulting in a lower risk of STIs, or unplanned pregnancies. Knowledge and openness are protective. As the Family Planning Association succinctly put it, sex education does not encourage children to have sex. It can have the opposite effect and delay the age that young people start. Knowing this should give parents confidence that talking won't put ideas in their head. Usually these are already brewing. Instead, it will give them tools to handle the ideas and pressures that are inevitably out there. By starting before adolescence, you also get to shape your child's understanding of healthy sexuality before the wider world fills in the blanks. If you don't teach your child anything about sex or bodies until, let's say, the age of 13, by that point, they have surely absorbed something from somewhere. Maybe playground rumors, TV, YouTube, possibly even pornography, or sexualized content that they've accidentally encountered. And what they pick up might be skewed or scary or just plain wrong. A lot of kids today stumble on internet pornography at very young ages. And if they've never had a grown-up explain the basics to them, that's their first sex education, which is not what we want. So let's talk quickly about the timing of exposure to things like porn or sexual content. Surveys show the average age of first exposure to online pornography is around 11 to 12 years old. Some kids do see it earlier. One study by Common Sense Media found 15% of kids had seen porn by age 10 or younger, often accidentally. And more than half of the kids in that survey said they bumped into adult content by clicking ads or links without realizing. And a startling 41% of teens said they'd seen porn during the school day, at least once. So if we wait until 13 or 14 to talk about what pornography is and what a healthy sexual relationship looks like, we're likely years behind their first exposure to these concepts. One of my kids, she was probably in the 4th grade, and she was working on a book report on The Secret Garden. And she typed The Secret Garden into the website browser, and up popped a bunch of porn. And I hear, "Mom?" And so I walk in and see what she's looking at. And she's like, "I'm just trying to do my book report on The Secret Garden." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, okay, let's get out of this. X out, X out, X out." I said, "You probably need to type in book, The Secret Garden, and the author's name. That way you won't get into other information." And then we had the conversation about what she saw. "Do you have any questions?" She didn't. And I said, "Okay, if you do later on, please come talk to me about them, and we can have that conversation." Another one of my kids, after I was in my CSAT training and I had talked to this expert in the field on sex and technology, it was maybe a few months later that I get a text from my oldest. And at this time, with my 2 oldest kids, most of them did not have smartphones at the younger ages. And she was maybe in the 9th grade, and I think she had a smartphone. And smartphones were becoming more available, and more teens had smartphones. And someday, while she's at school, I get a text. And she says, "Hey, I just saw the first image I've ever seen of a penis besides our dog." And I read that, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm so glad she can text me from school. And I said, "Oh, how did you see that?" And she said, "I'll tell you when I get home." And I said, "Great, looking forward to that conversation." So she gets home and she's telling me that she's in history class. And she said that somebody's just passing their phone around. And she eventually figured out whose phone it was. And she said she has a boyfriend. And so basically this boyfriend had sexted her, this girl, and she was passing the phone around the classroom, and everybody's passing it to the next person, passing it to the next person. She said, so they passed me the phone and I looked at it and I wasn't sure exactly what I was looking at. And then it hit me. And so I passed the phone on, and then I texted you. And I praised her. I'm so glad that you texted me. And asked her, I said, "So what did you think?" And we had that conversation. And then I said, "Well, this seems to be a good lesson in learning about sexting," which I'll talk about more later. But I said, "This is a good opportunity to talk about sexting." And she was like, "Yeah." And I said, "Did that boy know that this girl was going to pass around photos of his penis to the entire history class?" And she said, "Probably not." And I said, "Yeah, that's part of the problem with sexting is you can't guarantee that these images are kept confidential. And you probably should assume that whatever you're sending isn't just kept to that one person that you consent to share it with." Starting these conversations early is about staying ahead of the curve, giving them context and values before they encounter the more challenging stuff. One more benefit of starting conversations before adolescence is it desensitizes the topic. By the time your child is hitting puberty, if you've been calmly educating them about their bodies and boundaries and consent for years, they're less likely to have a negative response, and they're more likely to listen or engage because it's not totally foreign to them to have these talks. You didn't just suddenly flip a switch at 13 and say, hey, now it's time to talk about something we've never, ever even talked about or addressed. Instead, it's just an evolution of these past talks. So begin before adolescence, even if that simply means answering questions when they come up in early childhood or bringing up teachable moments here and there. It does pay off. One study emphasized that when children are educated about sex from early ages, they're more likely to engage in healthy sexual behaviors later on and feel comfortable seeking information. What exactly should these ongoing conversations cover? Again, that evolves with age. In the pre-puberty years, focusing on the fundamentals like correct names for body parts, the basic idea of reproduction, nothing too in detail, nothing too in depth because they won't understand it. Personal boundaries and consent. Also focus on respect for themselves and others, even in simple ways, like we don't make fun of other people's bodies, and respecting personal space. Hey, that's why you need to knock on the door before you walk in a room. As kids approach puberty, which is around the ages from 9 to 12, conversations should include what changes to expect in their bodies, the concept that sexual feelings may start happening and that's normal, along with family values or your faith perspectives on sexual behavior, presented in a positive, non-shaming way, is helpful. If you have a religious framework that you're using, this is a time to start to share the meaningful, loving context that your faith envisions for sex, rather than the shameful messages about don't do it. By adolescence, proper talk should broaden to relationships, love, dating, consent in depth, contraception, STIs, emotional readiness, and yes, pornography, if you have not already encountered it. We need to be talking about what it is, why it's not a good guide for real life. And if you've laid the groundwork earlier, these heavier topics become easier to tackle because the channels of communication have already been opened. The key through all ages is to adapt to your child's maturity and questions. Do not dump all the info on a 6-year-old because they're not going to understand it anyway. Nor should you hide the truth from a teen. They likely already know more than you think. Answer what they ask. Also, prompt gently on important things they haven't asked. It's like building a puzzle over time, adding more pieces as the picture becomes more relevant. So now that I've covered the when and the why of starting early, let's get into the content of what to convey. What are the key principles and values that we should be teaching and emphasizing in these conversations? I often boil it down to a few core ones: respect, consent, and trust. So let's break these down. When you're talking to kids or teens about sex and relationships, it helps to have a framework of the key values you want to instill. As I said, for me, 3 of the most important principles are respect, consent, and trust. When I'm talking about respect, this covers respect for others as well as respect for oneself. We want young people to understand that any romantic or sexual interaction should be grounded in respecting the other person as a whole human being with feelings, rights, and dignity, not as an object or a conquest. It also means respecting themselves, their own boundaries, health, and values. In practice, teaching respect might sound like, if you're in a relationship, treat this person the way you'd want someone to treat you. Or treat this person the way they deserve to be treated the way they want to be treated. I'll usually follow this up with that includes kindness. It includes caring. And you should expect the same in return. Nobody should pressure or demean the other person. It also involves avoiding derogatory language, which includes discouraging kids from using terms that objectify other people as if that's cool. Instead, talk about people as people, not trophies, not an object. When my two oldest were in high school, this wasn't the same for the youngest two. Things had started to change, and the language that they were using as teens was different than my older two kids. My older two kids at the time, they would use language. If somebody was overly emotional, if it was a girl, they would say, calm your tits. Or if it was a boy, they would say, calm your nuts. And the first time I heard this in my kitchen, in my house, they were talking about it and they had said that. And I said, hey, is this how you guys refer to emotions? And they were like, oh yeah, somebody needs to calm down. They need to chill out. And I said, how do their emotions relate to their genitals? And they looked at me, and my kids are looking at me like, Mom. And I said, well, I find that confusing. Often our emotions are separate or should be, our emotions don't involve genital parts. And then I talked about how that's objectifying. And also, if we're telling them to calm down, it's not actually what helps calm a person down. That usually we have to have a conversation about what they're feeling and why they're feeling that way and validate it and let them know that we understand and that makes sense to us. My kids were not, this was not a new way of having conversations with them. And their friends, I think, knew me well enough that they could roll with it and accept that. And I think it was a month or two later, some other kids were over with this friend group and who weren't there that first time we had the conversation, who repeated that phrase. And the other kids were like, oh, you can't say that in front of Jackie. And they looked at me and I said, yeah, I really don't like that. And they said, why? And my kids' friends explained why. And they were like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I said, your emotions aren't really about genital parts. And I think that is degrading to talk to people that way. And it doesn't talk about the emotions that a person is feeling. This wasn't something that my kids' friends were not used to me stepping into some of the conversations that I was overhearing. So for me, respect ties into everything. If a teen respects their partner or their friends, they're not going to pressure them into sex or gossip about intimate things to their friends. If they respect themselves, they're not going to allow someone to treat them poorly or push them past their comfort zone. Now, one great tool here is to model respect in your own relationship. Kids notice how their parents speak to each other. If they see mutual respect at home, that becomes their baseline expectation. I know I had had a conversation with my husband before our kids were even teens. And I think it had come up, we were in a conversation with some other parents and one of the fathers had said something, we often got comments about like, 4 daughters. And then they'd say to my husband, like, wow, how are you going to protect them all? I hope you have a lot of guns or something to that effect. And so after one of these conversations, I said to my husband, it bothers me that people say this. And he said, it bothers me too. And I said, right, like you're supposed to respect their sexuality with guns? That doesn't make sense to me. And I had told him, I said, I think the way that you treat our kids and the way that you have been treating our kids does more to protect their sexuality than a gun ever would. And he had commented and said, well, I just think if we are not having that relationship until they start dating, and then I'm exerting the power over them and this boy that comes to pick them up, that just feels awkward to me. That would feel very uncomfortable. And so we agreed on that. And we'd had that conversation, and we both agreed that we wanted to separate out our kids' sexuality when they started dating from being our responsibility. And our responsibility started from the time they were born and the relationship that they saw us having together, but that also they had with each of us as parents. There's also media or real life situations that can spark chats. Things like, I noticed in this movie that boy kept badgering the girl even after she said no. What do you think about that? What would a respectful approach look like? I watched a lot of news. It wasn't 24/7 news, but I would watch the news, and there were stories, and I didn't shelter my kids from hearing those stories. We often had those conversations, whether that was at the dinner table or at different times during the day when they heard the conversation. Sometimes only one of them heard it, but I wanted to bring it up at dinner and get their feedback. It wasn't a lecture. Usually their dad and I was approaching it with curiosity, like, what did you think about this story? Or knowing it was our job to make them feel like their world was safe, which I think they did, but they could understand and navigate these different news stories that were coming up. Another key factor is consent. I think this is absolutely crucial. And thankfully, it's getting more attention in recent years. I remember when my kids were in elementary school, my two older ones, and consent started being talked about in terms of sexuality. A lot of my neighbors were freaking out, thinking that the schools were going to be talking to kids as young as kindergarten about sexual consent, and they hadn't had conversations with their kids about sex. And I remember saying, well, I've talked to my kids about consent, and what I talked to them about at 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 years old was very different than what I would talk to them about sexual consent. It's not that different, but I was not talking about sexual consent at 2 or 3. I was saying you don't have to hug or kiss somebody if you don't want to. They were like, who are they hugging and kissing? And I was like, their grandma. I saw a lot of my neighbors, again, restrictive, religious community, very conservative in their ideology, freaking out about this. One of them finally said, well, like, what were you telling your kids in kindergarten? And I gave an example of chasing a boy. At recess, if they're chasing a boy, does he want to be chased? Is he tired of being chased? Maybe he liked it when the girl started chasing him, but maybe he gets tired of it. Maybe he doesn't want to do that anymore. And if he says, I'm done, or I don't want to do this anymore, then you need to stop. They backed down and calmed down. And they said, that's teaching consent that's age appropriate. And if you lay that groundwork, it just becomes much easier when they're hitting puberty and their teen years to have a conversation about sexual consent. Sexual consent means any sexual activity, from a hug to a kiss to a date to intercourse, should only happen when everyone involved actively agrees to it, freely and enthusiastically, without coercion or pressure. I will usually say real consent is a hell yes and a high five, not after you've worn them down because you keep pressuring or pushing them. And like I said, teaching consent starts young. Silence, the other important factor that I think you need to be teaching kids is silence is not consent. The person has to say yes or no, and their yes has to be enthusiastic and freely given. And anyone has a right to change their mind at any time. I think it's also important, especially for teens, to understand consent and the law. For example, sexual activity with somebody who's underage or too intoxicated to consent is not just wrong, it's actually illegal. I also think if you have sons, I did not, but I think we have to teach our sons that consent is mandatory. Not because girls are going to falsely claim rape or not because girls are going to falsely claim sexual assault. That puts them in a opposition towards the girls. When we're teaching our sons about consent and that it's mandatory, that it can be still flirtatious. We're not getting consent robotically or changing the mood, but we need to make sure, does this girl want to be kissed? You can do that in a way that still fits the mood of kissing. I remember several years ago, I was asked to present at a local conference on consent and why it matters. This was shortly after the Me Too movement had started, maybe the next year. And when they were planning the conference, I wasn't part of the organizing team or part of the organization. But when they were planning it, the person who reached out to me, who was a female, had said, when we were planning this conference, some of the men on the board who were helping to plan it said, I think we need to discuss how Me Too is so hard for men and making men feel bad. And she had said, well, we haven't even discussed the Me Too movement. And so I think we need to discuss that before we talk about why it's so hard for men. And she had reached out to me and asked me if I would do a presentation on consent. And so I did. As I'm getting ready to present, I could tell, they're coming in with their football jerseys on. The University of Utah's football team walks in and sits on the back row. And I had a conversation with them afterwards. They came up and talked to me, or several of them did. They got some extra credit or some credit in a class if they attended the conference. And they had decided to come to this breakout session on consent. And so I saw them walk in and sit down on the back row. And I was like, oh, I didn't know they were going to be here. Took a deep breath. I started my presentation. I was opening it up for question and answers towards the end, and people were asking questions. And one of the football players had raised his hand and asked this very question. Wouldn't conversations about consent kill the mood? And I said, well, it could if you're doing it in a robotic way or in an awkward way. I guess, yeah, it could, but it doesn't have to. And I could tell he was looking at me perplexed, and he said, can you give me an example of how that doesn't kill the mood? And if I remember correctly, I said something like, okay, so let's say you're on the second date. You really like this girl. You really want to kiss this girl. And that mood is kind of set. And you say to her, I really enjoy spending time with you. And I really want to kiss you. Do you want to kiss me? And he shrugged and was like, okay, yeah. And I said, don't you want to know if she also wants to kiss you? And he thought about it for a minute. And he said, yeah, actually, I would want to know that somebody else feels the same way that I am feeling. And I said, yeah, and you should have a right to check that out so that you're not misreading things. And what I didn't say is that there has been research done with men who view pornography. They're shown a series of images and they're asked to identify the emotion that they're reading on a female's face. And often they confuse pain with desire. When I first read that was a little gut punching to me. When we have taught consent, we don't mistake those two. And I think that's really important to be teaching our sons that very thing. Peggy Ornstein notes that in our society, we have done a better job teaching girls to guard their boundaries than teaching boys to respect those boundaries. Boys often get fewer conversations about this, which is a problem. So with sons, I think you have to be very clear that men respect consent. It's not just about avoiding getting in trouble or being accused of something falsely. It's about caring both for you and your partner. It's also about her being able to express how she feels. One of the things in this presentation that I will ask is like, how would you know if somebody's not interested? And, several people from the audience are giving different answers. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe. Okay, sure, kind of. And finally, it was a college age young woman who raised her hand and said, don't you have to ask? And I said, yeah, you do. You have to ask. That's how you know. That's the only way you know. Otherwise, we're making assumptions. I think we also need to teach sons that they need to get used to hearing and accepting a no. And that's not a personal rejection. That's not a personal message about them. That hearing no is okay. It needs to be okay. And for daughters, it's equally important to discuss consent. That they have the right to say no to anything that makes them uncomfortable. That being in a relationship doesn't obligate you to do more. And if someone doesn't respect your no, then that's a huge red flag. I think we have to encourage our daughters to speak up, and that we will support them if they face pressure. Again, talk about what enthusiastic consent looks like. It's not just the absence of a no, but the presence of a yes, and an enthusiastic one at that. One easy way to put it, because people will talk about how complex it is to teach consent, it really isn't. If you have seen the famous video on the T consent analogy, if not, go Google that and look it up. Very easy to explain consent. Basically, it comes down to, if it's not a clear yes and a willingly given yes, then it's a no. If someone isn't enthusiastic, the T consent video basically says, if someone isn't enthusiastic about having tea, then you wouldn't force them to have tea, even if they said yes to tea yesterday. So you can use that video, if that's helpful, and emphasize that consent is ongoing. It's needed every time. I'll usually say it's not an all-day pass. It's not a one-time and you're a paid member. And that consent can be revoked. This concept will carry them far in ensuring that their interactions are respectful and safe for both. And then the third key concept I like to talk about is trust. And I combine trust and honesty or openness because I think they go hand in hand. We want our kids to trust us, and we also want them to act in trustworthy ways themselves. That means being honest and communicating with their partners as well as with us. For parents, this principle is about fostering a relationship where your kids trust that they can come to you without being unfairly punished or ridiculed or shamed, essentially maintaining that open bridge of communication. It also means that you as a parent trust your child incrementally with information and with their own decision-making as they grow. When you talk about sex, convey that you trust them to handle the knowledge responsibly and that you trust them to make good decisions with guidance. This can be as simple as saying, I know these are big topics and I'm here to help you figure things out, or if you have additional questions. For the teen's own behavior, stress that trust is the foundation of any healthy relationship, whether that's with friends or somebody they're dating. You should be able to trust the person you're with, and they should be able to trust you. That means being honest about your intentions and respecting boundaries. If something changes, you develop feelings or you lose feelings or whatever, lead with honesty rather than deceit. This might involve talking about things like not cheating on someone, not leading someone on, and also not lying to parents about big safety issues. I think it's very common in our society for people to just ghost. We have that term, to just ghost somebody. That's not making you a more trustworthy person. It can be hard to let somebody know that the connection wasn't there, and maybe they express that they are interested and you feel that they're more interested than you are. Have the maturity to tell them that instead of just ghosting them. Trust also plays a role in teaching them to trust their own instincts. For instance, if you feel something isn't right, you're alone with someone and you get a bad vibe, or your friends are pushing you into something that you don't want to do, trust your gut feeling and step away. Let them know you never have to do anything that you feel isn't right. Empower them to trust themselves. That's part of building self-respect. And really, all of this ties together. Beyond these three big ones, there are other principles that are important too, like empathy, which I would say is intertwined with respect and consent. Responsibility, being responsible for contraception or for the emotional consequences, and boundaries. You could certainly add more values to your family's list, but a beautiful thing is that if you really weave in respect, consent, and trust, a lot of the other positive behaviors will follow naturally. A teen who respects their partner and has a foundation of trust with them will automatically be more likely to be honest, kind, and careful in their relationship. A teen who understands consent deeply will automatically be considering the other person's comfort and feelings, which is empathy. One suggestion I do give is that when you do have the many talks, explicitly use these words: respect, consent, trust, and make sure that your teen hears you and has an understanding of what you're talking about. It can feel a bit like an after-school special that I don't think they have anymore, but that we all watched my age when I was growing up. But it is helpful to make sure to ask them to put that in their own words so that I know we're on the same page and I'm making sense. Sometimes they get the big concept, but they miss the nuances. For example, with consent, they might parrot something back like, consent means you shouldn't force someone, but they miss the nuance like needing an enthusiastic yes. And that's your chance to also drill that in. Yes, you cannot force anybody. Also, their yes has to be enthusiastic, and you need to listen to their answer the first time. Encouraging questions is half the equation. The other half is being proactive in teaching and influencing, especially in areas that kids might not think to ask about. One of these areas is the big new variable in modern adolescence, which is technology. Questions might come up about it. What do I do if someone sends me a sext picture? But often teens aren't going to ask until after something happens. So as parents, we need to proactively educate about digital responsibility, empathy, and boundaries. In this case of the dad at the airport, if you remember where we started, he specifically asked about Snapchat, which is a perfect lead in to this broader discussion of helping kids navigate the tech-driven world of sexuality. When it comes to sexuality and growing up today, technology is a game changer that adds new dimensions and challenges to everything that I've discussed. Smartphones, social media, messaging apps like Snapchat, internet pornography, online dating. Yes, some teens use dating apps or meet people online, and even things like video games and virtual worlds. All of these can intersect with a teen's sexual development and relationships. As this dad, James, rightly noted, it's so different from when we were kids. Our job is to prepare and guide and influence our kids for this reality. Not pretend that we can keep them in a bubble away from it. So let's break down a few key areas when it comes to digital sexual health education. The first one, and often the elephant in the room, is online pornography. As I mentioned earlier, the average age for first exposure to porn is around 11 to 12. And virtually most teens will see pornography in some form during adolescence. One study of American high schoolers found 56% had viewed porn in just last year. By late adolescence, over 80% have accessed it at least once. As researchers note, it's pretty normative by now. So we have to talk about it. The conversation about porn with your teen should cover several points. That number one, porn is not reality. It's staged, it's scripted, and it's edited. Even if these aren't porn actors and they're a boyfriend, girlfriend, or husband and wife, The bodies are often digitally enhanced or selected for certain traits. The scenes are often choreographed, and things are shown that are not reflective of typical healthy sexual encounters. I sometimes compare it to action movies. Just like watching a Fast and Furious movie doesn't teach you how to be a safe driver, watching porn doesn't teach you how to have a safe, respectful sexual relationship. In fact, it often teaches the opposite. The second thing I think you have to cover when talking about online pornography is that porn often shows unhealthy behaviors. A lot of mainstream porn is aggressive and it shows risky acts without a consequence. A startling statistic from the Common Sense Media Report is that 84% of the pornographic videos or images kids see depict acts of violence or aggressive behavior, like choking or R scenarios. Imagine your 13-year-old seeing that with zero context. They could easily get the message that that's just what sex is, that those behaviors are normal or they're expected. We have to counter that by explaining that porn often shows things like aggression or women in pain being portrayed as sexy. In real life, these behaviors are not okay, unless both people explicitly want that and consent to it. And most don't. Porn doesn't show the communication that would need to happen for something like consent. And a lot of it is downright abusive and definitely not how you should treat somebody that you care about. I think we should also emphasize porn's lack of consent. It doesn't show these consensual conversations. It doesn't usually include conversations about birth control or the emotional aspects of sex. Dr. Joe Court, who's a sex therapist, pointed out, the problem is when kids see porn and nobody is explaining it to them. Not every body part is going to look the same. That's part of what's leading to higher rates of body dysmorphia now. In other words, teens need adults to put what they've seen in context. To say porn is a performance, not an instruction manual. The third thing that I think has to be covered when talking about online porn is that porn can be exciting and confusing. Acknowledge to your teen that it's normal if they felt curious or aroused by porn. And it's also normal if they felt a little disgusted or disturbed, or all of these things at once. It's okay to have mixed reactions. Again, it's important that they know that you're not going to punish them for admitting that they watched something and needing to talk about it. I think you'd much rather discuss it openly without saying, oh, that's disgusting. This can be tricky for a lot of parents because their gut reaction is to say, don't look at that again. But if you react only with forbidding and anger or shame, you shut down the chance to influence them. I usually suggest first have the conversation and then ask them if there's any limits that need to be set to help them. For instance, talk about what they saw, how that's different from reality, why excessive porn can mess with expectations or become an unhealthy coping habit. And then you can say, would it be helpful to put some filters on our Wi-Fi or your phone? Acknowledge, I can't control everything you see, but if it's helpful, I want to help you reduce the chance of stumbling across it. And if you do see something again, please come talk to me. I'm not going to be mad, and I'm glad that you told me about this. This keeps parents in the loop rather than driving their behavior underground. And then another ingredient when talking about online pornography is to emphasize real relationship values. Influence by re-emphasizing things like mutual respect, caring, and pleasure that is mutual. Porn is typically about performance and visual stimulation for the viewer. It's usually not about the people in it truly caring for each other, even if they're feigning it. Tell your teen in a healthy sexual relationship, both people matter. It's not all about one person doing whatever they want, like you see in porn. It should feel good for both, emotionally and physically. If it's one-sided or degrading, that's not healthy. Again, if you have sons, stress that real sex is not about using a woman's body just to satisfy yourself. There's a powerful connection that happens when two people are sharing an experience. And if you have daughters, stress that they never have to do what they see in porn in order to please somebody. And this includes, with my daughters, I would talk about these things that come through into the general public, like the F me face that girls can pull. They've learned how to make that F me face. And they'll take pictures of themselves and share that on their social media sites. Having those conversations with your daughters is important. I also think you have to have conversations with kids in this digital sexual age about sexting and nudes. The world of Snapchat, Instagram, DMs, etc., means many teens face pressure or temptation to send intimate photos or messages. Let's be frank, sexting is relatively common among teens. Meta-analysis in recent years found roughly 15 to 20% of teens have sent a sext, like a nude or semi-nude image, and about a third have received one. Some studies even show higher numbers. This doesn't mean that every teen is doing it, but it's also not rare. Telling teens simply never, ever do it might not be realistic. They need a more nuanced skill set to navigate this. And here's how to tackle it. Discuss the risks plainly. Make sure they understand that once an image is sent, control is gone. Even on disappearing apps like Snapchat, screenshots, or third-party apps can save images. And things spread. So a rule of thumb is don't share anything in images or text that you wouldn't be okay with your whole school seeing. Not because we expect it to happen, but because it could. Teens often have an invincibility mindset. That would never happen to me. So share real life anecdotes appropriately. Consent also applies here. Emphasize that pressuring someone for nudes is not okay. If someone says, if you loved me, you'd send me a picture. That's emotional manipulation. That's not love. Encourage your teen to never succumb to that or use that. And conversely, if they ever receive an unsolicited, explicit image, that they have every right to block that person and should tell a trusted adult. This might sound like saying, if someone sends you a photo of their genitals without you asking, know that that's on them, not you. You won't be in trouble, but please let me know, or at least let some safe adult know, because that's not respectful behavior towards you. And this trusted adult can help you walk through the complexities of that. I think it is okay not to scare teens, but to have the discussion about legal consequences. It's important, and it's often not known by teens. Sharing sexual images of a minor, even if you are a minor yourself, can be considered distribution of child pornography under the law. Now, many states have been updating laws to be less harsh on consensual teen sexting, but it can still technically lead to severe penalties. And I think it's helpful for teens to understand it takes a long time for the laws to catch up with technology. So helping them to understand that this isn't just mom or dad being strict. There are actual laws that could get involved, especially if images are spread beyond the intended recipient. Interestingly, some teen advocates and researchers talk about teaching safe sexting practices, knowing that abstinence-only approaches have their limits. For instance, teens themselves have come up with strategies like not including your face or any identifiable features in a photo, using certain apps that blur images. Now you might be thinking, I don't want to have to teach my kid how to sext. True. And we're not encouraging it. But if they or their friends are going to do it regardless, let's minimize the harm. And this is a tough line, but perhaps say, look, the safest choice is not to send anything you wouldn't want shared. But if you or any of your friends ever do, please come to me if something goes wrong. And at the very least, never include your face or unique marks, and consider that anything digital can last forever. Essentially show that you're aware of the reality, but still emphasizing caution. Encourage critical thinking with your teens. Teens sext for many reasons. Some might do it to please a partner, some as a flirt, some out of curiosity or peer pressure. Talk with your teen about why someone might want to send or ask for a sext and whether those reasons are healthy. If your teen is older, like late high school, and in a serious relationship, the conversation might shift to, even if you both consent to sharing something private, how are you going to ensure that it stays private? You're asking questions like, why are you wanting to share this? Is it coming from this place of mutual trust? Or is it coming from insecurity or pressure? Encourage them to never do anything sexual online or offline as a result of being nagged or to prove something. Those motivations usually lead to regret. Now, this dad at the airport specifically mentioned Snapchat, but similar issues apply to Instagram, TikTok, WhatsApp, etc. So key points to cover with your teens are privacy settings and personal info. Teach them about using privacy settings like keeping accounts private, not accepting friend requests from random strangers, disabling location sharing on apps like SnapMap, unless absolutely needed. Talk about what's safe to share and what isn't. So, for example, no sharing of their home address, their school, their phone number in their public posts. Also caution them that even innocent posts can be taken out of context. So they should think before posting. My kids were in junior high and high school. If they had social media, I typically followed them just to know what was happening and to stay informed as a parent. And one of her friends had been learning to play the guitar. And she put a post on Instagram that said something to the effect, I don't remember exactly, but it said something like, playing the guitar is so orgasmic. And the next time I saw her, which was next day, and I said, hey, can I talk to you about something? And she said, yeah, sure. And I let her know, hey, I saw this post on Instagram yesterday. And initially I asked her, do you know what the word orgasmic means? And she said, pleasurable. And I said, kind of. Do you know it's a sexual term? And she did not. It was a public post on Instagram. And I said, I think that using words like that, because she had said, like, oh, I'm not sexually active. And I said, okay. But I think when we're misusing words like this, and kids do this all the time, they use sexual terms that have some power and weight behind them in non-sexual ways. So I said, especially in a public post, but probably even in a private post, or if your account is private, using the sexual language may look like you know more than you do, or may make others think, oh, she knows about sex. And, she was grateful that I had approached her, and she was like, oh my gosh, that's so embarrassing. She opened her phone and deleted the post, which is, maybe too late, but better than nothing. But again, I just said, I think we need to be careful about words that we use. Words matter. And, sexual words are reserved for private sexual spaces. Another thing with social media and communication etiquette is to emphasize that on the other side of that screen are real people with feelings. It's much easier to be cruel or crude from behind a phone. So challenge them to hold themselves to the same standard of kindness online as in person. For example, don't say in a comment or a DM what you wouldn't say to someone's face. And if you see others bullying or spreading rumors, please come talk to me about how to handle that. I think this applies to many adults because I'm not still following a lot of teen accounts or anything. None of my kids are teens. I follow my nieces and my nephews who are teens. But I see a whole lot of adults engaging in this kind of conversation where they are very rude and crude behind their phone. And I hope that's not how they are in person. But if we're talking to our kids about this, we need to make sure that we are also practicing this and we don't become lazy online and start to use language that we would never use in person to somebody's face. I think talking to your kids about if a friend sends a digital picture, maybe it's a goofy picture, just to you, you don't have to share that with your group chat because that starts to break trust. We're just teaching the digital golden rule, or even the platinum rule of treating others as they want to be treated. Part of digital responsibility is knowing when to unplug. Adults are just as guilty of this as teens. And while this is slightly tangential to sexuality, it does intersect. For instance, late night phone use can often lead to riskier chats or viewing things when inhibitions are low. And parental oversight is asleep. So setting some boundaries like no phones in the bedroom after a certain time can protect kids from situations they're not ready to handle. It also helps their sleep. And I think it's fine to use parental control tools with transparency. So for example, we're going to be installing a monitoring app that flags explicit content or self-harm content. Letting your kids know that you'll respect their privacy in general, but you also want to be able to get alerts if something really concerning comes up and that you will have a conversation with them about it. The goal is not to snoop on every conversation. It's to keep your teens safe. And let them know that as they get older and they show responsibility, that you'll loosen this. Kids may not love this initially, but if it's framed as safety and not suspicion, and especially if they know that you're not going to overreact to every little thing the filter catches, they can usually accept it. But the proof is also in the pudding. If they test you with something minor and you handle it calmly, they're going to trust you more. Now, despite best efforts, your teen might see something disturbing, or they might get a weird DM from a stranger, or have a friend send them something inappropriate. They need to know that they can always come to you or another trusted adult when they feel out of their depth, even if they're the ones who made the mistake. Have a game plan, have this conversation ahead of time. Let them know that they're not alone out there in this digital jungle and that you've got their back. In practice, this could mean doing periodic phone check-ins where you sit down and scroll through some of their social media together. Not in a gotcha way, but reviewing their public posts. I mean, you should be following your kids, but reviewing their posts or saying, hey, show me some funny memes that you and your friends share. And using that as a way to stay in tune. If you do spot something concerning, approach it from curiosity and not immediate punishment, or maybe no punishment. The last thing I think it's important to remember is it's not all doom and gloom. Tech has positives too. You should acknowledge that fact and let your kids know that you see that there's positive uses of tech. Maybe your teen has learned a lot from a reputable YouTube channel about health, or they have good friends they met via a shared interest online. Let them know that you appreciate that tech isn't the enemy. It's about how we use it. When teens feel that you're not just demonizing their digital world, they'll be more receptive to hearing your cautions about it. I think it's also especially important to note again that you need to be following these same rules, or your teens will not trust you. One of the things I also think that can be helpful in this day of not reputable sources online that it can be confusing if it's a reputable source or not, the spread of mis and disinformation. As adults, we need to be aware of mis and disinformation as much as our teens do. I had a client I used to work with who was 20, and his grandmother had approached him, and the University of Utah, which is local for us, had a class that they were teaching. It was an in-person class. It cost like $50 a person or something like that, about how to spot mis and disinformation. And the grandmother signed up and attended and invited her grandson to do so too. And they went to this class, and I would ask him, like, what are you learning? And he would share with me what he was learning. And I would tell him how great I think that is, that we need to be educated and we need to take that responsibility into our own hands to be educated about the information we are consuming and how to spot mis or disinformation. The last thing I want to highlight is empathy and boundaries in the context of digital sexual content. Empathy in part means recognizing how your actions affect others. For instance, if a teen boy is watching a lot of porn that objectifies women, encourage him to think about the fact that those performers are real people. And that in real relationships, women are equals who have their own desires and limits. Acknowledge that learning these relational skills can be awkward and it can take time. Ask him to consider, how does watching these videos where women are degraded influence the girls that you know in real life? This can be a challenging conversation. And sometimes teen boys get defensive. But I do think it's worth asking the question. For teen girls, empathy might mean understanding that guys have insecurities too. And open communication helps rather than assuming what the guy is thinking based on what media portrays. Boundaries in digital life include not only privacy settings, but emotional boundaries. Not feeling obligated to respond to a romantic interest 24/7. Knowing that you can say, I don't want to continue this chat. And respecting when someone else draws a line. Teach them that it's okay to block or unfriend people who don't respect their boundaries. Online drama can get intense because people are hiding behind screens. And teens sometimes endure toxic interactions because of their social circles. Give them permission to step away. Let them know that they have the right to not engage with someone who's making them uncomfortable or who's making them feel bad about themselves. That is a healthy boundary. My daughter, when she was at college, had a situation where I think she had gone out with a guy at college 1 or 2 times. And he had followed her on social media. And she had let him know after the second date that she wasn't interested in moving anything forward, but was gracious and kind in letting him know that. And he continued to text her, and not texting her, DMing her, I should say. He was DMing her about his suicidal ideations. And it was overwhelming for her. Eventually, she looped me in. She let me know, like, I'm having these conversations. I think one of her roommates that was her high school friend had encouraged her, why don't you let your mom know what's going on? Because she knew the stress that my daughter was holding. And so she let me know, and she was like, I am worried about him. I don't want him to follow through on his suicidal ideation. But also, I don't know what else to do. This is overwhelming for me. And he was sending them multiple times a day. And so I stepped in, and he sent me his profile, and I messaged him directly. And I just said, hey, this is Jackie. I'm so-and-so's mom. And she let me know about the messages that you're sending her and that you're at risk of harming yourself. And you let me know that she has given you some support, or that she has offered you some resources, but that you don't want to use them, and that instead you continue to message her. And I said, like, this is overwhelming for her and her roommate because they don't know what else to do. And I said, I'm a mental health therapist, which is why she looped me in. And if you are having suicidal ideations, I do know what to do. And, we can talk through what options are needed. And so we talked through those. I think he did express possibly needing to go to the hospital and let them know that he was having a lot of suicidal ideations. And I encouraged him to do that. And I said, let me know if they don't admit you or you don't get the help that you need. I can look for some therapists in your area and recommend one. And willing to step in and offer that support as an adult instead of something for my 20-year-old daughter to have to handle. As you can see, there's a lot to cover under digital responsibility. You don't dump this on your kids all at once. It has to be woven into many talks over the years. You may be wondering, how do I even begin to approach this? My answer to any parent is approach it as an extension of all of the other values that you're teaching your kids. It's really not a totally separate beast. It's about respect. Don't misuse others' images, don't bully. And it's about consent. Don't share content without consent. Don't view someone as just a body on a screen. And trust. Talk to me. Let me know what's going on. That way, maybe you can be someone others can trust too. And having empathy. Remember, there are humans behind these usernames. And having knowledge. They understand tech and its pitfalls. As often as possible, use real life examples and keep the dialogue two-way. Ask your teen what apps they use and what they like or what they worry about or what they don't like about it. You will learn a lot about their world. And you'll show that you respect their experience and you want to hear their thoughts on this. I know we've covered a lot of terrain today, from shame and its harms to building trust and openness, to early education, to core principles, and the digital maze. I want to conclude by tying it back to that airport encounter and the bigger picture of why this all matters so much. I wish every parent could feel empowered to have these conversations with their kids and the knowledge that these conversations need to start young and that they had the confidence to do that. I also wish that every teen could have somebody caring, trying their best to support their teen, and who's unafraid to seek guidance from experts who know. For those of you listening who are therapists, particularly sex addiction and betrayal trauma therapists, you know firsthand how much unresolved sexual shame and lack of early guidance can contribute to problems later in life. We often find ourselves helping clients heal wounds that, had there been a different approach in their youth, might not have cut so deep. I like to think that by spreading knowledge among parents and professionals about healthy, shame-free communication, that we're doing a form of preventative therapy. We're reducing the fuel that can ignite into full-blown addiction or relational trauma down the line. It's all connected. The 15-year-old boy who learns from his dad that porn isn't real and that emotions in sex matter, and who knows that his dad can handle his own emotions, is perhaps the 25-year-old man who treats women with respect and doesn't develop a compulsive porn habit. The 13-year-old girl who can tell her mom that she started her period and she feels weird about her body and hears that, yeah, this is normal, it's okay, it's not the greatest thing that happens to our body, is perhaps the 23-year-old woman who has the confidence to insist on respect from partners and to speak up if something isn't right. Now, I'm not saying that only dads can influence sons and that only moms can influence daughters. I think the opposite is true and especially helpful. It's helpful for moms to have conversations with their sons and for dads to have openness with their daughters. For parents in the general public, I hope this long-ish episode reassures you that you don't have to be perfect to get this right. You just have to be present and willing. It is okay to admit to your teen, I don't have this figured out. Or at your age, I didn't have to encounter this, but I'm trying to figure it out. Or I might mess up and I talk about this, but I'm trying because I care about you. In fact, that authenticity likely strengthens your bond. Your kids don't need you to be a super cool, ultra progressive sex guru parent. They need you to be their steady, loving parent who's not afraid to talk about hard things and who has their back no matter what. By addressing shame head on and replacing it with education and empathy, we can break generational cycles of sexual discomfort and trauma. If you grew up in a home where sex was never spoken of except in hushed negative tones, you have the chance to do it differently with your kids. If you grew up in a faith tradition that emphasized chastity but left you with some shame scars, you can keep the values that matter to you and that you found helpful while working through the shame that was given to you that didn't serve you. I often remind people information plus compassion is the antidote to shame. When teens have accurate information and they know they're loved and accepted, even when they make mistakes, they'll thrive. So whether you're that therapist guiding a client on how to talk to their kids, or you're the parent listening while you're doing your errands or cooking dinner, you might be feeling a mix of determination and maybe a bit of, oh boy, this is a lot. I want to encourage you. You've got this. The fact that you've listened for this long, which thank you so much, tells me that you care deeply about getting this right. And that really is more than half the battle. Start with small steps. Maybe tonight at dinner, you bring up one interesting thing you learned from this podcast. See how your kids react. Or maybe you apologize to your teen for that time you snapped at them about something sexual that happened and you say, hey, I'm learning too. I want to try again. If you're a professional, share a nugget from this episode with a colleague or a client's parent. Over time, these small steps build a new normal. One where talking about consent is as common as talking about driving safely. One where a kid asking about sex isn't cause for panic, but an opportunity for connection and influence. So I wrap up, I want to leave you with a powerful thought from a researcher that I cited earlier, Kerry James, who said that telling teens just don't do it is a conversation ender. And that's true of so much more than sexting. Anytime we shut down dialogue with a simple no, or because I said so, or don't even think about it, we end the conversation and lose the chance to influence our kids. Instead, what I've aimed to illustrate today is how to start and continue the conversation. How to say, let's talk about it instead of don't. It might feel harder in the short term. It is certainly more work as a parent, and it is more emotionally taxing at times. But it does pay off infinitely in the long term with closer relationships and wiser, more prepared young adults. Talking about sex and the tough stuff doesn't make everything instantly okay, but it sure paves the way for them to be more okay than if we stayed silent. Thank you for sticking with me through this extensive conversation. I hope that you found it helpful, maybe a little challenging in a good way, and encouraging. Remember, shame dies when stories are told in safe places. Be that safe place for the young people in your life. Replace shame with knowledge and judgment with empathy. And at the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.